The first, a magnitude 6.5 quake, hit the southwestern part of the country on Thursday night. Then another, even stronger, magnitude 7.3 quake struck the area just over 24 hours later. For a closer look at this, we're joined by John Cassidy. He's a seismologist with Natural Resources Canada, and he joins us in Victoria. Let's talk about those pair of quakes. And there were a lot of aftershocks. I mean, the first one, I believe there were about 100 plus. But how unusual is it that a second quake would be stronger than the first?
It's unusual, you're right. It's not unheard of, and it happens in about maybe 5% of the time. So if you have a large earthquake, a 6.5 or a 7, there's always a small probability on the order of a few percent that it would be followed by a much larger earthquake, as happened in this case in Japan.
So when are they in the clear? I mean, are there going to be even more aftershocks?
Yes, we would expect aftershocks. Because this was a very shallow earthquake and a large earthquake, we would expect aftershocks to continue for probably a few weeks to come. The general pattern, and every earthquake is different, of course, but the general pattern is that the number of aftershocks will drop off over time, and the magnitude of those aftershocks will also decrease with time. And in fact, for yesterday's earthquake, the two largest aftershocks, which were 5.7 and 5.8, occurred within the first half hour of that main earthquake.
You mentioned it being shallow. The quake's epicenters have been about 10 kilometers from the surface. That translates into more shaking, more damage. Would that mean that any further aftershocks would also be shallow?
Yeah, most likely they would be. So the usual pattern again would be that the aftershocks would occur within the rupture zone of that main earthquake. So the rupture zone, a fault perhaps 40, 50 kilometers long in this case, and the aftershocks would tend to follow that rupture zone. So they would also be most likely shallow. Although other earthquakes, what we're learning as we study these large earthquakes around the world with a lot more detail, a lot more instruments and information, is that earthquakes can be triggered in the region. Other types of earthquakes may occur. So we can't rule out that other types of earthquakes might happen in the coming weeks or months. But the most likely situation would be aftershocks smaller than yesterday's earthquake that would occur within that immediate region and would decrease in time, both in magnitude and number of aftershocks.
The second quake especially hit a densely populated area. When you even look at just the population of Kumamoto, where it hit near and close to, that city has about 730,000 people plus. Are you surprised the number of dead isn't higher at this point?
I'm not actually, because Japan has very, very good building codes, as does Canada, United States, Chile, many countries, most countries around the world, very good building codes that protect us from the impacts of earthquakes. And so we saw a similar situation in Tohoku when the much larger earthquake occurred off in northern Japan. That the buildings overall did very well during that earthquake because they were designed to withstand earthquake shaking.
You have experience working in earthquake-affected regions, most recently in Chile in 2010, where over 500 people were killed. What are the chief concerns for rescue workers in the area right now?
Well, aftershocks is always one of those concerns, and after these large earthquakes, the ground just keeps shaking, so small aftershocks, larger aftershocks, and it's really quite a frightening experience to be in buildings where you can see cracks or some minor damage, and you're feeling shaking. So that's always one of the big concerns, is that a large aftershock might occur. Buildings have been weakened. And so that's something to be aware of in these regions. And it's very frightening for the public, for people living in that area. And if there are power outages or water shortages, that's always a concern as well.
Yeah, and there are reports of water shortages at this time, so definitely concerning for the people there.
That's right. And And of course, here in Canada, we have similar. We have earthquakes, much larger earthquakes than these two we've seen in Japan have occurred in Quebec, off the coast of Newfoundland, and of course here in British Columbia. So Canada is no stranger to large earthquakes either, and we've even seen pairs of earthquakes like the ones in Japan. Back in Saguenay in 1988, a 4.7 earthquake occurred, and then 2 days later, a much larger 5.9 earthquake occurred. So we've seen similar pairs of earthquakes here in Canada.
Appreciate your insight. Thank you, John.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
John Cassidy is a seismologist with Natural Resources Canada. We reached him in Victoria.